The Trump administration announced this week it would pay the French company Total Energy nearly $1 billion to abandon construction of two wind farms off the East Coast, and instead invest the money in oil and gas, focused on Texas.
I think this is outrageous. They're using taxpayer money to pay a foreign company to stop work on projects that would have provided clean, renewable energy to more than 1 million homes.
Instead, the administration is doubling down on fuels we know are disrupting the climate and creating air pollution that kills millions of people every year. I'm Ariana Brocious.
I'm Austin Colon.
And this is Climate One. Hey, Austin.
Hey, Ariana.
You know, we talk a lot on our show about the global dependence on fossil fuels. I mean, it is the driver of the climate crisis. But I just learned a kind of shocking figure. 70% of the world's population lives in a country that imports most of its fossil fuels.
Wow. I knew that it was a big number, but 70%, that is a lot of people at the mercy of the countries that control these commodities, or as they're often called, petrostates.
Right, and obviously that dependence and power imbalance has really shaped geopolitics.
Yeah, I mean, how many wars have been fought over oil? Can't even count.
And that brings us to the current war with Iran. Even if oil isn't the main factor behind the US and Israel's initial attacks, we're seeing in real time how disruptions to the global flow of energy can really hurt. The war has already caused global crude oil prices to spike by as much as 57%.
And I'm worried that there's probably more to come. I mean, the mere threat of Iranian attacks on tankers has throttled the shipment of oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz. And for reference, about 20% of the global supply moves through there.
Plus, there have been attacks by both sides on oil and gas infrastructure in the region. You know, refineries and export terminals take time to rebuild, so even if this war stopped tomorrow, it might be a long time before we see prices come back down.
In the U.S., gasoline prices are up about 80 cents a gallon, and diesel prices have risen even higher. Manufacturing, shipping, and trucking all rely on diesel. And then there's fertilizer, much of which also comes from the Gulf region. So that means just about everything is going to get more expensive. And to me, this really underscores how much the global economy is tied up with fossil fuels and the dangers of that dependency.
Yeah. And there's another trend happening at the same time: electrification, particularly of transportation and power generation. As the world electrifies, the global geopolitical power balance is shifting. Already, countries like Spain are bragging about how their adoption of renewable energy like wind, solar, and hydro is helping insulate their energy prices during this war. Though analysts have mixed reviews on exactly how true that is.
Right, but that's super interesting. I mean, petrostates are definitely not in their death throes yet. Electrons are not yet able to replace liquid fuels in every application, but it does seem like there's an opportunity here for a rebalancing of the world order. I mean, no one wants to be dependent on another country for most of its energy. So what I'm wondering is, can a country that's providing the world with cheap solar panels and increasingly cheap electric vehicles use that industrial and economic dominance the same way petrostates have?
Yeah, you're talking about China.
Yeah. Some are calling China the first electrostate. And for something like 20 years, China has invested heavily in building the factories to make the components and products that are driving electrification worldwide. We're talking batteries, EVs, solar panels.
Yeah, the scale at which they're churning out those goods is driving down their price pretty much everywhere outside the US. I just read that China is even providing solar panels to Cuba amid the US oil embargo there.
Yeah, and while China is definitely ahead of the curve, it's not the only country working to diversify its energy supply. Today, we're going to explore what the rise of the so-called electrostate means for traditional petrostates, and what that means for the rest of us.
To better understand what defines a petrostate, our colleague Kushanavadar spoke with Tatiana Mitrova. She's a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and former head of research in the oil and gas department at the Russian Academy of Sciences.
So there's this school of thought that as the world electrifies, fossil fuels will become kind of like less of a geopolitical weapon, and there will be a growing divide between these two types of countries and how they get their energy, the petrostates and the electrostates. I want to break this down for listeners. So let's start with just petrostate. Imagine you're at a dinner party, you're talking about your work, and somebody says, "What's a petrostate?" What do you say?
I will say that it's a country which builds its international leverage, its geopolitical power and influence based on hydrocarbons, on oil and gas.
Okay, so hydrocarbons, we think oil, gas, kind of fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels, yeah.
Okay.
And it's not just about extraction ability to produce oil and gas, but it's also the leverage related to the ability to trade those commodities, to organize financial flows, to organize physical flows, and to control choke points. Yeah, sounds familiar these days.
Yeah, it does. Yes.
So,
Like in the Strait of Hormuz, for example.
Exactly. So all the naval capabilities, but also having international oil exchanges and all the financial institutions that serve them, having the currencies that are serving these transactions, and having an ability to affect very quickly prices for these commodities. So in this respect, we can easily say that Iran, Russia, United States, Saudi Arabia are very clear examples of petrostates. These industries, first of all, are important for their domestic economy, for their GDP, for their industrial performance. They are extremely important for their international geopolitical positioning. They are providing them with significant leverage. I mean, if you look at the size of Iranian economy these days, it's negligible, but the leverage it has due to the control over the choke point Strait of Hormuz is incredible. It can affect the global economy.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's not just that a country gets lucky that the land it lives on has access to all of these natural resources. It's that they have the infrastructure, they have the currency, they have the leverage to actually turn that resource into control on the world stage. Is that similar to the logic behind what you would call a state that's an electrostate? Like they own everything that it takes to make, I don't know, electricity?
To a certain extent. With the electrostate, it's the similar power, so domestic economic growth and international geopolitical influence, which is built on manufacturing capacity to produce equipment to produce electrons. So it's a more complicated supply chain. China is not directly exporting electricity, right? Nevertheless, most of the countries which are importing PV panels, windmills, batteries, all the grid equipment, not even mentioning all the critical minerals for this stuff, they feel dependent on China because, okay, you've imported a barrel of oil, you've consumed it, it's gone. That's it. Your dependence, it's over. If you imported, let's say, battery storage equipment, which will operate for the next 20 years, it's much longer lasting dependency because the technical standards, the very scheme of connection, and not mentioning all the maintenance of this equipment and spare parts and further upgrade software, which all the modern equipment needs, it comes then from the electrostate which produced it.
It is a geopolitical energy subscription service.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. I never thought of it as like, oh, I'm signing up for Amazon Prime. Not to be glib about this, but like
and
they
then
create
you forget
a
to
platform.
unsubscribe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then suddenly, whatever, geopolitical messes happen. So that is the electrostate.
And I would say how it is being implemented so far, it's much more hidden and slow. While petrostates usually act in quite brutal and fast way.
Right.
And the effect is visible immediately. You just close the strait and everyone is absolutely shocked. With the electrostates, it's much more softer. It's less visible.
Mm,
You don't even feel that you are dependent for a period of time.
right. Like a subscription service. This is actually becoming a very helpful metaphor in my head.
Yeah. Yeah, but at the same time, we should keep in mind that electrostates are slowly already eating parts of the market from petrostates.
Mm.
So this sudden change, which was acknowledged just recently, that actually the growth of internal combustion engines fleet has dramatically slowed down. It was happening initially just in China. Then several other countries also started to support EVs, including the US, European countries. It was popular. It was like environmentally friendly. So many people started to buy a second car, EV, just to have it. But then at a certain point, you look at the global car sales structure and you see that electric vehicles are becoming dominant. And this is this slow, invisible change that actually affects a lot the global oil demand.
This brings up a very interesting aspect. Do you think electricity and clean tech supply chains realistically could be weaponized the way oil and gas have been?
Not the way the oil and gas. Yeah, these are two different mindsets. Yeah, and as I said, oil and gas is something fast and furious. Yeah,
Yeah.
it goes
Mhm.
up to the point very quickly. The electrostate mentality, it's much more coinciding actually with China's thinking. Yeah,
Mhm.
the whole philosophy. You just sit on the bank of the river and wait until the body of your enemy will flow. You don't need actually to go into war, into the direct
Mm.
confrontation and battle. You just create these circumstances which are weakening in an invisible way your counterparty, and then you take the opportunity when it appears.
Wow. Okay. And on the consumer side, let's say that Europe electrifies and decentralizes its energy system. Does that permanently reduce Russia's geopolitical leverage for all the reasons we've just been talking about?
Yes, and it reduces leverage of all petrostates.
So not just Russia.
No, just Russia. It's also basically it's reducing the leverage of OPEC countries.
Mm.
It's reducing the leverage of the US as long as it is choosing to be petrostate rather than electrostate. Like 4 or 5 years back from now, it was not clear where the US is moving. The recent years, they have shown more of this petrostate mentality, rhetorics, and action. I'm not sure that it's forever. It can be changed. Actually, well, China wasn't electrostate like 20, 30 years ago.
Right. And I want to sum this up because you're starting to answer my last question that this led me to, because you mentioned 5, 10 years ago what the world was like, what the thinking was like. So 5, 10 years from now, how do you see the global balance of power shifting as the world electrifies?
I have to start with geopolitics. And unfortunately, it's not our fault. It just happened. Right now, the world is entering into the next stage of geopolitical turmoil. So 80 years after the World War II, quite comparatively peaceful and calm coexistence. Right now, we have much stronger regional tensions. It's a natural cycle. Yeah, again, it just happens. We cannot stop it at the moment. But it means that geopolitical fragmentation and confrontation will be much stronger. And that means that all these different tools and different mindsets of petrostates and electrostates will become very visible because they will have to clash.
Interesting.
It doesn't mean necessarily that this is all going to be military conflicts, but trade wars, different alliances against each other, tariffs, sanctions, I'm afraid it will be there, which leads us to the design of the energy systems. Yeah, because energy is serving economy which lives in this geopolitical environment. So if you know that your counterparties might block supplies, might put sanctions on your imports or exports, or freeze your financial payments, what would you prefer to do with your critical infrastructure, with your energy supplies, which is absolutely critical for the survival of the modern civilization? You would prefer to make it as much autonomous as possible, even if it is more expensive. Yeah, but just to be on the safe side, which means that petrostates will use a lot their own petroleum and gas reserves locally, while importers will try to expand their renewable generation and all the electrification in order to apply renewables not only in the power sector, but also in all the other demand sectors. But also you might think, okay, if there could be such types of disruption, I myself, as a household owner, I would prefer to have a solar rooftop with a battery storage and a small diesel generator, just in case.
Tatiana, thank you so much for joining us on Climate One.
Thank you so much for great questions.
Coming up, how a reordering of the world's dominant energy powers will or won't impact developing countries.
Having enough energy for new jobs, new factories, is the priority for many countries. They're not thinking especially about climate change, although climate will affect them deeply. They're thinking about economic priorities and feeding these mouths and having enough jobs. They'll use energy from any source that they can get.
That's ahead when Climate One continues. Today, we're exploring the idea of the rising electrostate as a counter to the long-standing dominance of petrostates, namely countries that produce and export the fossil fuels the rest of the global economy depends on. But our next guest says these two frames are kind of like comparing apples to oranges. Vijay Vaitheeswaran is Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor at The Economist.
So when people talk about electrostates, I wonder what they mean, because electricity is a fuel, and petroleum is a fuel, but people mean something different. It sometimes takes on a totemic value, something like the old Soviet Union versus the U.S. in the Cold War, and positing that there's a battle between electrostates and petrostates. And I do worry that it oversimplifies the situation. Most countries, indeed all, are a mix of electricity and petroleum. That's one thing, right? There's no pure electrostate. There's no purely electrical country nor will there be a purely petroleum or fossil fuel country. The second problem is that we're kind of conflating two different things. Electricity is a final fuel, meaning it's what comes to the walls in our houses, right? The great energy thinker Emery Lovins once pointed out that people don't care about energy. They care about cold beer, hot showers, right? Most people don't think about where their fuel comes from. And maybe that's how it should be. So electricity, the thing that magically comes out of the walls, it can be made by fossil fuels, and it can also be made by renewables or nuclear. And so we can't conflate the end fuel with the primary fuel. And there's a third kind of thing that does trouble me, and that is just electrifying doesn't guarantee a good end state, although I'm a big fan of electrification. It's very clearly the direction of travel that we're heading in. We're even in something like an electricity supercycle from an investment thesis point of view, the way that the China supercycle 30 years ago brought on a commodity boom and so on. It's pretty clear we're heading in this direction, and I think good things will come from that. Broadly speaking, when we electrify the end use of energy, you make things much more efficient. Why is that? Because when you are stuck with using fossil fuels, you have to combust, and combustion is very inefficient. It's a dirty, nasty, polluting process. It's bad for the local environment, and it's also bad for climate change. And you lose maybe 2/3 of the energy in an internal combustion engine when you burn it as gasoline, whereas electrical motors, we know, in an EV would be 80-90% efficient at the point of use. And so it's a more efficient way to use energy in transport, in industry, and in our homes. And so broadly speaking, this is a good trend, but people sometimes use it as a proxy to say we can solve climate change through electrification, and the electrostate is going to lead the green revolution. They often point to China. I say, just be careful. China is leading on electrification. They've done a lot of it. They didn't do it because of climate change. They did it for energy security reasons, for domestic energy consumption reasons. Right now, as the world is in the midst of the worst fossil fuel-induced energy shock in the world, China is little bit less vulnerable to that shock because it is an electrostate or heading in that direction. But a lot of it is because it has coal. It's going to use the coal to make electricity, right? To replace the LNG that doesn't come from the Middle East, and liquefied natural gas. So it's not the climate narrative, it's an energy security narrative. And I've only told you about my beef with the electrostate. I haven't talked about the petrostate. We can spend another half an hour on that, but I won't.
Well, we could. I want to unpack some of what you said there. First, this idea that this sort of dominance, hegemony, whatever you want to call it, that has been exercised by petrostates, if we want to call them that, like Middle Eastern countries and the US to some extent, that's because it is sort of this on-off flow that you can control and has immediate real ramifications, right, in the markets for pricing, for supply, whereas electricity, if you're creating electricity because you have solar panels or wind, that fuel's there. That fuel's, as reliable as it ever is. And so I'm wondering along those lines how you compare the influence that China might gain through technology supply chains rather than the control of natural resources. So, talking about solar panels, batteries, EVs, that they are producing at scale and very cost effectively.
It's true that China moved early and moved big on a number of areas of clean energy, right? Of course, the US invented solar panels, Europe subsidized them to become more viable, but ultimately it was Chinese technological prowess, economic scale, state capitalism, and the willingness to subsidize at scale. The reason they dominate the processing of almost all critical minerals, in part, is because they're willing to accept that nasty environmental pollution that came with it and the cost to humans that work in those areas, but also because they can agglomerate capital at a very large scale and invest for the long haul with very low returns. They saw it as a strategic investment. Very clearly, they saw that as a potential for economic advantage, and they did that. Nothing stopped anybody else from doing that, right? And there's some small examples of Australia, some countries in Latin America that could certainly expand into this area. But the Western markets, capital markets, the way that Wall Street works on short-termism doesn't support this. So they took advantage of an opportunity, and that gives them power. And they've exercised that power pretty recently. When provoked through American tariffs, they responded with the economic leverage that they had. So that's true. Here's the problem. You can't compare that to the OPEC embargo of oil, for example, which people like to point out as sort of a comparison point. Again, the electrostate versus petrostate. Here's why, and it's very topical because some 50 years on from the original era of embargo, which brought the global economy to its knees, we're now at a moment when there is clearly the biggest energy shock since then, maybe even bigger than that time the world is living through. When the oil gets cut off, once our strategic stocks, which last about 90 days, according to the rules of the International Energy Agency, to become a member of the IEA, you need to keep something like 90 days worth of strategic stocks. Once those are depleted, our cars and buses grind to a halt. That is, the global economy literally stops. It'll be utter chaos. If the Chinese or any other putative superpower of clean tech were to cut off the critical minerals or cut off the solar panels, guess what? You got 20, 30, 40 years of solar panels in your house or in your country because the fuel is free. Nobody can block the sun. Nobody can block the wind. Your batteries will continue to store power for your grid for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And in that time, you can build your own very expensive solar panels and replace the Chinese input. So yes, there is an issue. It is a choke point, but you can't compare apples and apples here. Those are very different kinds of leverage and different kinds of power. There are security risks, and we need to take appropriate steps. Stockpiling, domestication of supply chains, foreign shoring, these are all good things to do. And there's a role for government in this, not just private sector, because Wall Street won't pay for most of this. But we can do those things. That's very different than asking, where on earth did God put crunched up bones of dinosaurs? And guess what? It's 4 or 5 countries that have enough oil to last 100 years, and that's about it. And so that's a very different kind of concentration risk than with clean tech.
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning the critical minerals because that is something, as you said, China has really invested in and taken on and is really, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of the power in terms of controlling a lot of those supplies at present. The US is kind of trying to compete, but to my understanding, we are not.
So this is just a nascent effort. We started a bit under Joe Biden. His administration did recognize this risk, but they didn't get very far. And we're doing more enthusiastically, or at least with more noise about it under Donald Trump. We'll see how far it gets. But this is not hopeless. Japan felt the ire of the Chinese critical minerals embargo 15 years ago, where they got into a political conflict with China, and they were cut off from some Chinese exports. And so for 15 years, the Japanese government is engaged in a very serious, expensive, all-of-government effort with industry, and they've had some significant success in reducing their dependence on Chinese critical minerals. Not 100%, but they've put a lot of resources into it. And among other things, it's not just about duplicating the low-end, expensive and dirty kind of processing that China does. It's about innovation. And so the most recent data on patenting, for example, in this area in critical minerals shows Japan, now it's one of the top producers of new world-class patents in critical minerals. What does that mean? Innovation can help us get around this processing problem. There's new materials technologies, using AI to discover new kinds of materials, substitution effects. So we can find our way around some of the older critical minerals or rare earths with some new technologies and better ways of doing things. Then the US and Europe should get on that bandwagon.
So I'm wondering about how other nations, setting aside the US and China for the moment, how this spread of cheap technology could enable countries in the global south, Africa, South Asia, Latin America, to sort of skip over fossil fuels and really embrace electrification and thus become much more energy secure in their own right.
When we look at this from the perspective of developing countries, and I do this quite a lot, my job has been global for a long time at The Economist. I've been based overseas in multiple emerging markets. Things look a little different than when you sit in Washington or Brussels or even in Beijing. The primary concern for many developing countries is energy poverty, energy access. I mean, we know this. 800 million people perhaps have not had their first connection to the grid, no light bulb in their home. Often it's women and girls in these countries that walk miles a day to get biomass or cow dung or other really horrible forms of energy that burn in a very dirty way. Indoor pollution kills millions of people every year from this kind of access to bad energy. And energy for development is the other important idea, that with Africa and India achieving a demographic dividend, as they call it, that is young, hungry populations ready for growth, having enough energy for new jobs, new factories is the priority for many countries. They're not thinking especially about climate change, although climate will affect them deeply. They're thinking about economic priorities and feeding these mouths and having enough jobs. They'll use energy from any source that they can get. They're concerned about importing expensive liquefied natural gas, for example, from overseas, LNG, because it's an expensive form of energy. They'll use domestic coal if they can. India has a lot of coal, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam. So countries that have coal will use it. They're not particularly thinking about a green energy leapfrog because it pleases Western environmentalists, right? That's not why they're doing stuff. Even though they're vulnerable to climate change and they understand the problems of burning coal, they mostly blame America and Europe for having caused this problem. And you see, I've been to climate summits every year that the UN has held for many years. And we see this from speech after speech from developing country ministers. You created this problem. You go first. We'll come along later.
They're not wrong. They're not wrong.
Of course not. And so that's why, and even China, the great electrostate, has been held out by those who, have a certain way of looking at the world. They are the world's leading consumer of coal. They're continuing to expand their coal output and their capacity to use coal. And so we just take it with a little grain of salt, right? The picture is a little more complicated than people present. Having said this, I think the phenomenal benefit, the gift to the world, given by Chinese willingness to subsidize clean energy technologies for these last 30 years, means that now it is cheaper to put up solar than to put up new coal anywhere in the world. And certainly cheaper than gas plants. And battery costs are falling even faster than the costs of solar did, which matters because, of course, solar is intermittent. The sun only shines during the day. But if you can pair it with a battery, then you can get firm power, 24/7 power. Over time, that's what we're going to see. You can pair it with wind. Again, China has brought down the cost dramatically because of market forces and bottom-up cost effectiveness. We saw this in Pakistan a year and a half ago, where suddenly a fifth or more of the country's electricity capacity came from informal solar panels that people bought at the local corner store, the bodega as it were, and with no permission given by the government. It wasn't the utilities. Frankly, the official utilities, which had coal, were letting them down. There were power cuts all day, and so the people found an informal Chinese solution. And that's fantastic. So across the Sun Belt, this is what's happening. It's happening because it's inexpensive. In Donald Trump's America, where the government is anti-solar officially as policy, anti-batteries, anti-wind, The official government agency, the Energy Information Administration, predicts that 90% of new energy is going to be zero carbon or low carbon in America, even under these hostile policies, with solar being the leading source of new generation installed in Donald Trump's America. Why? Because it's cheap. You go to Texas, deep red Texas, pro-Trump
Yeah.
Texas, batteries, solar are going gangbusters. And so I think that's fantastic. It's great for local pollution because it saves lives today. It's terrific for dealing with climate change in the long haul. But that's not why it's being done. It's done because it's economic. And I think that's, again, a gift that Chinese have given the world. People around the world in developing countries are welcoming this, and they should. And those who are willing to accept Chinese cars like BYDs, which are fantastic, much cheaper and much higher quality than those that America has produced so far, they're seeing a great leapfrog to electrification. And we're seeing innovation on the back of that, battery swapping out of India and Kenya, for example, for 2- and 3-wheelers. And so we're seeing innovation on the back of innovation coming from the developing world. So I do predict a leapfrog, but it's happening mainly for organic bottom-up reasons, not because of enlightened government policy or climate change conferences.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So given China's dominance in the clean tech manufacturing, which has driven down prices dramatically for solar panels, EVs, and so on, how should we think about the trade-off between affordable, competitive green tech and the competitive threat it poses to nations that have traditionally relied on fossil fuel exports to support their economies, like the US, which is, I think, currently the biggest exporter of fossil fuels?
I don't shed a lot of tears for the Saudi Arabias or indeed the United States of the world, which are able to weather a decline in fossil exports if that should happen. There are 20 or more middle income and middle-sized fossil exporting countries that are not as big as Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, not as big as the United States, and that are high-cost producers. They're going to get into trouble pretty soon. And so in the next 10 to 20 years, a bunch of national oil companies that don't have the capacity of a Saudi Aramco, which is extremely well-run, very professional oil company in Saudi Arabia that has world-class technology. They're deploying AI. They're actually controlling their methane emissions. This is not what you have in many parts of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, where you have small countries. Sometimes their institutions are not great. Sometimes they're corrupt. The local companies have not learned much in the last 30 years. They've let their foreign partners like Exxon or Chevron or Shell do the heavy lifting. And so
Venezuela is a good example of this.
Exactly. In fact, you see them, they've gone in the wrong direction. They've really driven it into the ground through corruption and cronyism and so on. 30 years ago, Venezuela's company, PDVSA, was considered the best run national oil company in the world. I mean, really phenomenal cadre. Most of those people have left. And so in these places, you're going to find debt crises, maybe on par with the Latin America debt crises of the 1980s coming, because they're petro-dependent states. They're petrostates, but they're not sinister petrostates the way that, again, the simplified electrostate versus petrostate dynamic calls it out. These aren't sinister countries. These are troubled countries. Many hundreds of millions of people will be in a tragic state as the world weans itself off of oil in the coming decades. These countries cannot compete against Saudi oil, which the old joke in Arabia is stick a straw in the ground and the oil comes out. The lifting costs are so low in the Gulf, most other countries will not be able to compete. And all those other countries that are so-called petrostates along the way will be victims, collateral damage of this transition.
So there's a lot of hand-wringing in the United States about the rise of China in many sectors. And we've seen a total 180 in federal industrial policy that we saw under Biden and now with the Trump administration in terms of meeting the moment and really embracing all of these different forms of renewable energy and investments. If you were advising the U.S. government on industrial policy, how would you suggest they meet this challenge?
I don't think it makes sense to take on yesterday's technologies. The great hockey player Wayne Gretzky explained his success by saying, I skate to where the puck is going to be. And so I don't think trying to take on China on solar panels, which is an utterly commoditized technology, makes much sense. The U.S. can't compete on a commodity product where China has scale and market dominance. So when you say renewables, not those renewables, but maybe next generation perovskites, as they're known, right? Much more high efficiency, more expensive, more complicated, not yet commercial. Or again, with fusion or with hot rocks geothermal. There's a multiplicity of low carbon technologies that might even provide clean, firm renewables energy, something that, again, solar alone or wind alone cannot. And there's the AI-enabled control systems that manage all of this. There's the technologies for enhancing the grid, stuff like superconductors and wires and so on that let you expand how much energy goes through wires without building new rights of way or dealing with the NIMBY problem. The U.S. is in the world lead on multiplicity of climate tech innovation, energy innovation. I would say we need to invest much more and figure out how to scale those up. So many of these companies die on a death by pilot. They can't get money for their second plant. And so I could usefully see industrial policy or some public-private partnership coming in to help scale those up the way that the Chinese did with the solar, with the wind, with one after another, with EVs. I wouldn't go as far as the Chinese by downplaying the environmental harms or the labor abuses and so on that go there. But we could certainly do more on that. And that, I think, is where the U.S. could contribute to the world. And I think, frankly, the U.S. is on that track. We could double down on that.
Vijay Vaitheeswaran is Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor at The Economist. Thank you so much for joining us on Climate One.
It's been a great pleasure.
Coming up, how and why China has put so much effort into advancing renewable energy and clean tech.
They are building their economy based on this new power system, which is cleaner, more low carbon, and in many ways at a lower cost.
That's up next when Climate One continues.
Today, China's factories make 80% of all the world's solar panels. That staggering figure shows just one way the country has jumped to the front of the pack, investing in clean energy and new technologies. China may appear to be the first electrostate, but the actual picture is more complex. I talked with Shuo, director of the China Climate Hub at the Asia Society Policy Institute, about the country's path in these last 20 years. China just released its 15th five-year plan, which reinforces rapid expansion of clean energy with a target to double non-fossil energy over the next 10 years. But some have criticized the new emission reduction targets are not quite meeting the moment. What do you make of the plan?
Well, I think this plan is, of course, drafted in a very volatile geopolitical environment. I think it reflects two desires from the Chinese government. The first one is in light of all the global volatilities, they want to play it safe. There is a very strong emphasis in this plan ensuring energy security. And of course, in the Chinese context, when you talk about energy security, you will inevitably need to rely on coal, which is, a fossil fuel resource that China can supply itself.
Mm-hmm.
Then the second signal from the five-year plan is the Chinese government is going to double down on their clean tech sector. These sectors have really matured over the last 10 to 15 years to the point that when you look at, for example, wind, solar, batteries, electric vehicles, China now really occupy a very large share of the global market. Solar, for example, China single-handedly produces 80% of the global solar panels.
That's striking. I know that, but that's still such a huge number.
It is. And the government basically decided over the next 5 years, they are going to continue a large scale integration of clean power sources in Chinese power grid.
Right. Okay, so that's kind of the context we're in right now. Let's step back, maybe 15 to 20 years back. At that time, what was China's core energy problem? What vulnerability was the government trying to address?
Yeah, well, the Chinese government back then were trying to address quite a few pressing challenges. Number one, if we go back to the 2000s, this was a period where China saw very rapid economic growth. And as a result of that, the government was trying to ensure sufficient energy supply. So that's their challenge number one. Or challenge number two is, China entered into the WTO in the early 2000s, but it was not satisfied to just, make T-shirts for the rest of the world. The government wants to have the country climb gradually up the industrial chain. They want to be able to produce and manufacture higher value-added goods. The third concern is toward the end of the 2000s, China encountered very, very significant domestic environmental problems. most prominently air pollution, the air
Yeah.
apocalypse that we saw in major Chinese cities, for example, in Beijing. And they're also while ensuring energy supply, trying to clean up their domestic environment.
So China's trying to deal with a rapidly expanding economy, wanting to advance that economy, further develop it, get into some of these more advanced sectors. Simultaneously, they've got pressure at home because of very real environmental risks and threats that are coming in large part from their long dependence on coal.
Exactly. And their answer to addressing these three challenges all at the same time is to really put political support and resource into a set of new industries that could actually help the country upgrade its economy, drive growth, but at the same time, also clean up its domestic environment. And those sectors are basically the ones that we see now very much maturing and globally competitive. Wind and solar at the very beginning, but then over the years, batteries and electric vehicles.
Right. And I just think is worth stressing. It's not just that there's government investment, a significant amount, but also just simply the scale that you're talking about allows for prices to come down over time, right?
Yeah. And that all led to, really astronomical numbers that we have seen in recent years. Last year, China installed 370 gigawatt of wind and solar. The US, I think, installed a bit more than 20 gigawatt. So we have almost 20 times difference during last year between the US and China.
Wow.
So China is really kind of way ahead in this game. It's in its own league. The scale there is just, unlike anywhere else in the world. And that, I think, is the reason that many analysts now call them an electrostate.
Yeah.
They are building their economy based on this new power system, which is cleaner, more low carbon, and in many ways at a lower cost.
And we'll get into a bit more of the petrostate, electrostate conversation in just a few minutes. I'm curious, though, as this was happening in the last 20 years or so, how this transition has been framed by the government within China to the Chinese people.
Sure. Well, I mean, at the very beginning, if we go back to the 2000s, we still saw this very strongly held view that embracing renewable energy, such as wind and solar, is not necessarily in line with the country's economic growth agenda, right? But with the growth of the clean tech sector in China, now really contributing to a very large share of China's GDP growth. Last year, for example, the clean tech sector contributed to about a third of China's GDP growth.
Wow.
So that's a very notable share. And I think that gave the Chinese policymakers confidence that really they can reduce their emissions, clean up their domestic environment, will grow their economy at the same time.
Yeah, there's this long-standing way of thinking that you cannot do both things. You cannot grow your economy while decarbonizing. And obviously, China has proved that that is not the case, that you can do both and grow quickly and invest a lot. So despite this huge electrification push and the dominance in renewables, China is continuing to build coal plants. What's the logic there?
So coal is a source of fossil fuel that China can better supply domestically compared to oil and gas. I mean, we're now seeing how the situation in Iran putting uncertainties on China's global oil supply.
Right.
But in contrast with that, China can largely supply its coal demand just based on domestic resource. So that's why politically, coal has long been perceived as the safe option when it comes to energy security. And it has really played a very large role in China's economic reform and opening up, right? Really providing the lion's share of energy that the country so needed. But in more recent years, as China managed to integrate more and more wind and solar, a lot of coal-fired power plants were used to help the country regulate the fluctuating power grid, to kind of provide that load management. For many energy analysts, is not seen as the smartest option. China can actually embrace other market reforms to actually better balance their grid. And hopefully that's what will happen. Coal's role can be reduced, and China doesn't need to build more coal-fired power plants.
Yeah, and I also understand that the country's building a lot of nuclear reactors. And so that's another form of carbon-free baseload power, that reliable, always-on power that a lot of utilities depend on to balance out the intermittent factors of solar and wind. Though, of course, with the combination of batteries, they are increasingly reliable. So how would you say this shift toward electrification and renewables has reshaped China's political economy? Like, who are the winners and losers?
Well, China could reorganize its whole economic strategy, right, based on the electricity. So just think about, the EV sector, right? If you have a lot of power supply in your system, and increasingly the power supply is becoming greener, it could actually enable you to deploy more electric vehicle at a lower cost, both for, consumers, but also at a lower cost for the planet, because we're talking about more green power from wind and solar.
Mm-hmm.
And also abundant electricity supply could enable increasingly China's ambition, right, to embrace high-tech sector. AI is a hugely energy demanding sector. And China, I think at this point in time, is much better positioned to actually supply the power demand required by AI than the United States. So the general point is the more electrified you are as a country, as an economy, the better positioned you will be to reorganize your economy and to embrace more technologies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that one reason China has used coal is because they have a lot of domestic supply, and that makes it a very reliable and stable fuel source. China imports about 70% of its oil, and there's been a lot of market instability as the U.S. military action has taken place in Venezuela and Iran. I'm curious if you think electrification has materially reduced China's exposure to some of these fossil fuel price shocks.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. Just looking at the transportation sector, right? If China were continue to rely on traditional vehicles, then China's reliance of imported oil will be even higher than it is now by embracing electric vehicles. And I should say electric vehicles now is more than 50%. I think it's getting closer to 60%
That's
of
incredible.
new vehicles sold. So yeah, I mean, if you go to a big city in China these days, it's actually difficult to spot a traditional engine vehicle in China.
Wow.
So this is also helping the country to move away from this reliance on risky fossil fuel supply from overseas.
Mm-hmm. So we've spent a fair amount of time talking about how much China has invested in many of these clean tech industries and how successful they've been in taking over market share. China sells a lot of things. It's not just supplying its own market. Are there risks here of developing overcapacity in the clean tech space?
It's a very interesting question, right? I mean, I think from a purely climate point of view, we all want abundant supply of low-cost clean tech products. I think at the end of the day, that will help the world decarbonize in a faster way.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a counter argument is if we consider the need to actually tackle climate change. Instead of lower supply, maybe there's under demand, right?
Yes.
Maybe deployment is not fast enough. The bottom line of this is it's very important to realize that the Chinese industrial competitiveness, in particular in the clean tech sector, is really a feature now of the country's economic growth and economic strategy. The low-cost solar panel from China, we're not going to wish that away. They will continue to produce solar panel at a cost-competitive rate, simply because they have a large domestic market. They now have integrated their supply chain so effectively, and they're producing also at a large scale, which helps them to manage cost. So their competitiveness is deeply rooted. So then the real question for, I think, the rest of the world is how do we react to that competitiveness, right, in our respective national interests? And I think there are actually ways to leverage that smartly so that, cheap and good quality low carbon solutions can benefit other countries. And there are also ways to ensure that some of the concerns, for example, related to national security and so on, can be managed.
Mm-hmm. You use the term electrostate, and that's sort of the focus of this episode, is trying to dig into this idea of if the 20th century was shaped by petrostates, are we entering a new century shaped by electrostates? And if so, is China serving as the prototype?
Well, I mean, I think China is already firmly on track to become an electrostate, right? Powering its economic growth with electricity and greener electricity, and to actually use that to enable further economic growth. This is really going to be a snowball rolling by itself. I also genuinely see that this is the direction to go really for the rest of the world. Petrostate sounds very much as a concept from the last century. And I think more and more countries will increasingly realize which concept actually represents the direction of travel.
Well, yeah. And I mean, we are seeing the U.S. engage in international conflicts that at least have partly been tied to oil supply. And that's not dead, at least in terms of this administration's view on things. But I hear you saying it's kind of the past and not the future. So in that context, how do you think about China's role with other countries, the leverage it has over, other countries in a geopolitical sense, the appeal it offers to other countries in a partnership sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, we are now still looking at the situation in Iran unfolding, right? And a lot of countries are looking at that and they're worried about their oil and gas import. And I'm sure many of them are thinking and looking into alternative sources of energy. Maybe not in the immediate term, but as part of their medium to long term planning. And I think renewable energy in general will become more appealing as a result of the crisis now in Iran. And of course, China is really the most competitive provider of renewable energy products to the rest of the world. So the stronger desire to ensure energy security will indeed also empower China geopolitically.
Yeah, when we spoke before, you mentioned the example of Brazil, which has really worked to not just allow Chinese EVs for sale, but actually try to recruit those companies to do the manufacturing in Brazil. Can you speak a bit about that and how it kind of exemplifies what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I think Brazil is a very interesting example, right, in terms of how they have reacted to Chinese clean tech competitiveness, Chinese products and investment. The Brazilian government realized that in addition to just be a consumer of Chinese export, they also want China to come to Brazil to invest in the country and to help them strengthen their industrial competitiveness. And that's exactly what they did. They put in some tariffs just to trigger that foreign direct investment from China. And Chinese EV makers like BYD indeed followed that direction. BYD, ironically, actually took over an old Ford factory in Brazil and converted that into an EV plant. And by doing all of this, I think Brazil will be able to benefit from some of the Chinese industrial know-how. It will also benefit the consumers there because for a long time, all the other non-Chinese automakers, they do not see Brazil as a very exciting market. So they were very comfortable just selling Brazil really old-style cars. And by having Chinese EV brands, the Brazilian authority actually were forcing other auto brands to actually work harder and provide better products to the Brazilian market.
That's a really interesting story. So in the case of the U.S., there's a widespread consensus that the U.S. in this moment under the Trump administration is ceding a lot to China and other countries in terms of competitiveness. You gave a great example now about how Brazil has worked with China. What do you think are some smart ways that the U.S. could work with China as an electrostate to advance its own interests, probably under a different administration?
Yeah, well, I think, policy consistency is very important, right? I mean, in particular, when you're trying to work out an industrial strategy, the Chinese experience showed that you really need long-term planning and you need commitment and dedication. You cannot afford to swing from the left to the right overnight. That is not good news for market. That is not good news for you to cultivate a globally competitive industry. And in terms of ensuring that policy consistency, one essential question that the U.S. needs to answer is, do you need Chinese inputs? And if yes, how do you ensure that you can benefit from Chinese industrial inputs while at the same time accommodate some of the other concerns or considerations, such as national security and protecting domestic industry?
Right.
It's going to be a hard balancing act. But I think the most important thing that the U.S. needs is to be very clear whether you need the Chinese inputs or not.
So we've spent much of this interview talking about high-level things, economies, government investments, markets, so forth. I just want to take a second and ask what this transition has felt like for an average Chinese person. What does it feel like today on the ground in Chinese cities and industries and households?
I'll tell you two things. One is, despite the fact that air pollution is still a problem in large parts of China, if you go to a major Chinese city, Beijing or Shanghai, you stand just on the roadside, you begin to realize the roads are becoming much quieter, and you don't smell fume out of the vehicles. And this is simply because of the very rapid transition to electric vehicles. The second thing, hypothetically, if you're average Chinese these days, you come to the US, you get on an Uber, or you just kind of look at the cars, the vehicles here, you will start to realize that this is a bit like traveling back to history. The style of the cars here, the technologies compared to the Chinese vehicles, I think there's at least a one generation gap there. And if we kind of fast forward this dynamic, this gap, 5 years or 10 years, I think a lot of Chinese people, if they come here to the US, they will start to feel like they're probably coming to, maybe not Cuba, maybe not that extreme, but this generational gap here in the US vis-a-vis what is happening in China.
Yeah, we're going to be left behind if we haven't already been.
There is still a chance to catch up, I think, but it requires, again, policy consistency. It requires, a very dedicated effort to figure out what is indeed a very complex China question or China challenge.
Mm-hmm. Li Shuo is the director of the China Climate Hub at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Thank you so much for joining us on Climate One.
Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, it's Ariana and Austin. We've reached the end of our show, so it is time for Climate One More Thing. Austin, what have you brought to talk about?
Well, Ariana, have you heard of the New York Times 50 States, 50 Solutions project?
Yes, it is great and gives me a lot of hope. Lots of climate solutions in there.
Right. So they basically picked out a climate solution for every state in the country. And on top of that, they also had thousands of responses that didn't make the cut for the series. And they published a few of those last week.
Oh, cool.
Right. And, some of them are small, some of them are more like system change things. But I think my favorite one is this small group of fly fishers who were concerned about having, cold, clean water. They constructed more than 100 beaver dam analogs to keep more water on the landscape.
Oh my gosh. Where was this?
Actually, it was in South Dakota.
Wow. Did they use their teeth?
I don't think they used their teeth. The article didn't say, but I'm guessing they did not use their teeth.
Well, that's a cool way to protect their local watershed, make it more resilient against climate.
Yeah. So, Ariana, what do you got?
Well, I have been fascinated by a story I read a couple weeks ago on the meteoric rise, it seems, of balcony scale solar. It's a little solar panel you can plug in,
Right.
and it helps contribute to lowering your electric bills, giving you that resiliency. But it's not at all, as complex or expensive as doing rooftop solar. This has become super popular among people who want to have a bit of their own energy production, but maybe they live in an apartment and they don't own their roof.
Oh.
And so far, 28 states have introduced bills that are allowing this. And so we'll have to see what happens there. There's only one state right now that currently does, and that's Utah. But it would be great if more states adopt this as a resilience and energy supply solution, especially as we're seeing just really high energy bills for so many reasons. And then, of course, increasingly high gas bills on top of it.
Yeah, and as a renter myself, I am very excited about this technology, and I hope that New York approves it soon because I will be putting plug-in solar panels. We don't have a balcony, but I could put them in our little backyard space and, generate a little power. Why not?
Perfect. Well, that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to know what kinds of stories we're reading, sign up for our newsletter at climateone.org.
Climate One is a production of the Commonwealth Club. Our team includes Greg Dalton, Brad Marshland, Jenny Park, Ariana Brocious, Megan Basilia, Kusha Navidar, and Rachel Lacey. Our theme music is by George Young. I'm Austin Cologne.